Hi everyone. So last week in chapter 4 we were looking at godliness, gifting and growth. And godliness being all about being devoted to live lives that are pleasing to God. And it's not this ethereal concept, but it's very much a practical outworking of the inner transformation that happens in the lives of believers that are trying to follow Jesus. This week we see how Paul was explaining to Timothy how we should treat, love and care for a diverse congregation in both age and social position. So our key points for this week: Number 1, care for God's family. Number 2, care ministry. And 3, care for church leaders. Number 1, God's family. Now we have to remember in the first century that these early Jesus communities were radically different from those around them. But there was no social care or health systems for people to fall back on. And the family of God is called to be radically different from the world in all of these areas, but also wise in terms of how they use their resources and time so as to not be distracted from their primary purpose, which is to preach the good news of Jesus. The family unit is such a gift from God to the world. And when healthy, it's the best place for people to be known, to grow, to be nurtured, discipled and disciplined because they feel loved, known and belong. In this first century, especially in a place as diverse as Ephesus, the church was made up with such extremes of society, people that were really wealthy, high positions, all the way down to people that were even slaves. And the Church of God was called to be radically different in the way that it related to each other. It shouldn't be based on their financial position or power, but based on an intimate family model and a caring dynamic that recognises the value that God has placed on each individual member. So Timothy was challenged to think about how he would teach and shepherd people from these different ages. As he starts to challenge those who were older than him, that were maybe even those that were spreading some of the false teaching, he was not to shame them publicly or rebuke them harshly, but to speak to them as though they were his father. In discipling younger men and women, he should think of them as brothers and sisters, and the older women as though they were his mother. When we become followers of Jesus, we're adopted into this family of God, and therefore the way that we relate and care for each other should model that of a healthy family dynamic, where we respect our elders, care for our elderly, honour and respect each other, and treat members of the opposite sex with complete purity as though you would a brother or sister. At the end of the chapter, Paul even then talks about the importance of respect between that of slaves and servants or their employers. Both are children of God, both serve the same Lord. Masters were actually exhorted to treat their servants with respect and kindness in Ephesians chapter 6. And here Paul reminds also those servants to respect and serve their masters well as they are fellow believers. Number 2, care ministry. So one of the issues that this church was wrestling with was how to care for widows. At that time, a woman was fully dependent on her husband, and if he died, then on her family for provision. The early church was trying to work out how to be fair in terms of providing for those in the church family that were widows. And Paul is trying to provide them with some practical guidelines on how they should do this. He first of all reinforces the importance of the family unit and the responsibility that they have first and foremost to care for their own. Therefore, any widow that has children or grandchildren should first look to them and be provided and cared for by them. Secondly, younger widows that may have the opportunity to be remarried or cared for shouldn't become dependent on the church from an early age, as that may prevent them from actually finding security and a new home and may lead them into unhealthy habits. And finally, he charges the church to care for those widows who do not have anyone else to provide for them, but that they should be godly women who are followers of Jesus. Paul's concern is that the church family should take care of those within the church family who need it the most, but they shouldn't take on the financial burdens of trying to solve for every social issue at that time, and because it would distract them from their primary purpose, to preach the good news of Jesus. Number 3, church leaders. Caring and treating church leaders fairly is where Paul goes to next. Leaders of the church, especially those who are devoted to teaching and preaching the good news of Jesus, are especially vulnerable to spiritual attack, as the devil wants to discredit the message of the good news out to the world. And so if they're unable to devote themselves to faithfully studying and working to lead the church because they're distracted by needing to raise funds for their own families and to find employment, they won't be able to be as effective. So Timothy's reminded that appointed church leaders are worthy of being financially supported and provided for by the church family. Secondly, Paul reinforces that accusations against any elder or church leader should only really be entertained if brought by 2 or 3 witnesses, to ensure that they are not just being discredited because somebody doesn't like or agree with them. And there's not to be any favoritism either, or any cover-ups in the way this is handled. Timothy is to treat everybody equally and fairly, and that those in positions of authority who are found to be persisting in sinning should face discipline, and that their actions and consequences dealt with in an appropriate public forum. The point is here, nobody is more important than the sanctity of the good news. Leaders are especially called to be ambassadors of this good news, and their actions matter, and the way that we deal and treat them also matters, holding them accountable for their actions. So what's our application this week? Well, first of all, are there people in your own family that need your help and support? Maybe you've got members of your family that are widows, or who actually are without jobs right now, who do need your support and encouragement and practical giving. Secondly, are you an employer? Do you have members of your team at work, or are you a line manager? Or are you somebody that's blessed enough to have a domestic helper or a nanny as part of your household? How do you treat them? How do you care for them? How do you show them their worth as a child of God? Thirdly, do you pray for your leaders regularly, the leaders of our local church, those that are at the front line preaching and teaching the good news of Jesus? And do we give regularly and generously to our local church so that they and their families can be provided for? Look around you this week and ask God, who is it that you're asking me to practically care for, and can I grow in godliness as I do so? Have a wonderful week, ladies. We'll speak to you soon. Bye.